from the hub at Ambience Public School. And we have with us Dr. Yatin, who's actually in Milan, and he's joining us and conducting the session from there. So, Dr. Saab, can you say a quick hello to everyone?
Yeah. Hi, good morning, all of you, and thank you, ma'am, for having me here.
Yeah, and see the power. That's what I was saying, that wherever we are, we can still connect. That's the beauty. And thank you, sir. And then we have Ekta Kapoor from Lotus Valley. Would you like to say a hello to everyone?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ekta Kapoor Anand, as ma'am already has introduced me. Looking forward to a session where we can learn so much and help children moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you on the session. Then we have from Maharaja Agarsen. Is that not? It's not Mansi. Yeah, can you introduce yourself, ma'am? Can you hear me? Ma'am, you're muted. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Good morning,
We
ma'am.
can hear you.
Yes, I'm Sanjesh from
Yeah.
Maharaja Agarsen.
Yeah, great to have you, Sanjesh, on this session. Yeah. Then we have Sushmita and Mayuri. Would you like to say a quick hello, both of you?
Good morning. This is Sushmita and this is Mayuri. We are from Lotus Valley and looking for an enriching session. Thank you.
Yeah, you are from Lotus Valley, Noida, I think.
No,
Isn't it?
no, Lotus Valley, Gurgaon.
Okay, you are also from
Right.
Gurgaon. Oh, okay, great. Poonam ma'am, would you like to say a quick hello?
Hello, everybody. I'm looking for a fruitful session. Thank you very much.
Okay. Then we have Harshita, who's the coordinator for this session. I think she's joining us from AIIMS. Harshita, would you like hello to everyone?
Good morning, everyone. I am in Yatin sir's team, and I look forward to a fruitful session as well.
Great. Then Harpreet, we are seeing you. We missed you last time, both you and have you.
Good morning, ma'am. My name is Harpreet, and I'm from Ramjas Public School Day Boarding, and I'm looking forward for the session.
Okay.
And I'm sorry I couldn't attend the last session.
Yeah, we missed you. Then we have Lily Kuti ma'am joining us from Modern School. Ma'am, would you like to say hello? Okay, I think there's some audio issue. I think you can ask your IT person to correct that. But yeah, great to have you on the session, ma'am. We also have Prashant joining us from Echo India. Thank you, Prashant. And we have Manpreet ma'am supporting us for the IT. So great to have everyone. So today's session, I just wanted to give a little bit of not really an overview, but just what was the thought behind today's session, which is focused on substance abuse in young children and how to kind of know and be aware of it, and how to kind of ensure that our children are made aware of the pitfalls of getting into substance abuse, how to be assertive and say no. So all those aspects we'll be touching upon. That over the years we've seen that more and more children are engaging in this kind of behavior, and so prevention is what we should look for always, rather than trying to solve, because then it is even more difficult once a child has got into it. And I'm sure Dr. Yatin will touch upon all those aspects, and the gateway drugs, and how young children just without realizing get into maybe sniffing fluid and then experimenting, and then the peer pressure that gets them initially hooked into it, and then it becomes, because it is very addictive, it becomes very difficult for them to get out of it, and by the time we realize, it's too late. And what is shocking is, as I said, that children as young as in grade 4 and 5 are actually experimenting with it, and sometimes I wonder, what do you do? I mean, children are growing up too fast, or they're exposed to too much, and so we need to kind of, create this awareness, equip our children to be able to say no, and to be able to discern, what is right and what is wrong, and what is, good for their health, and create this support structure for the children that they can come and share with you if there is an issue. And as teachers and adults, we are aware of the flag signs, the red flags, and we kind of can make out if a child is, maybe indulging in this behavior, and then how do we kind of go from there. So over to you, Dr. Saab. One thing was Akshita, I think you weren't, yeah, so great to have you on this session. I think she's presenting a case today. Yeah, so you want to
Hello,
say quick?
Hi, I'm Akshita, representing AIIMS Public School, Subdivision Enclave. I'm a counselor here.
Yeah, so over to Dr. Yatin, and I would also request everyone, to come up with more cases, every time, because that's the whole idea of this session, that you discuss whatever concerns you have. We have an expert who can help us. So please feel free to discuss cases. Yes, sir, you can go.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So as ma'am has told that in today's session, we are going to talk about substance abuse. And as ma'am has introduced me, I'm working at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. We have a de-addiction center situated at Ghaziabad. That's the place where I practice primarily. So I like to begin with a few numbers. Actually, not many of them, but yes, very important ones. These are a few figures that I like you to focus on. The one on your extreme left is regarding tobacco use, then there is one on alcohol use, and finally there is one on cannabis use. Now, these are results from a survey among a population in which the respondents, they used tobacco and at least one other psychoactive substance. Now, these numbers are few, but they are very important. They are very big numbers, actually. So if you look at the one for tobacco use, 78% of the respondents in this survey said yes, that they had used tobacco in the last month. 63% said yes to use of alcohol in the past month, and 26% said yes to use of cannabis in the past month. And you might be a bit surprised to know that these are findings from children and adolescents. And the children and adolescents who are regularly going to the school. Actually, this was a study that was commissioned by NCPCR, which is the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights. And these numbers are startling. That's why it's very important that we talk about the issue of substance use. But before we go there, let's understand what we mean by this term substance, because this is the term that we're going to use a lot in this session. Actually, the term substance, technically, the full term is psychoactive substance, because the term psychoactive is very important here. And it primarily refers to any chemical that acts mainly upon the brain. And as a result, it causes certain changes in the functions of the brain or mind. These include perception. Perception would mean the things that we perceive through our senses. For example, vision, hearing, taste, touch. Mood, the way we are feeling. Consciousness, that is the awareness of self and those around us. Cognition, our thought process. And finally, the behavior, that is the thing that we are doing. So a psychoactive substance is any chemical that can alter one or more of these functions. And this definition is very important because psychoactive substance is not the term that we are very familiar with. What we commonly refer to these psychoactive substances, the term that we use is drug. That is a more popularly used term rather than psychoactive substance. But for the purpose of this session and for the purpose of substance abuse, we can use these two terms interchangeably. I must mention here that in medical science, the term drug would mean any medicinal product as well. But here we are not referring to drug as any medicine. We are using the term drug for a psychoactive substance. Another term that people use to represent or label these substances is addictive substances. And that kind of reflects that somebody who takes these substances can get hooked onto these substances. And that's why people use the term addictive substance. Now, there is a common misconception, I would say, among general public, including probably the users of these substances. They kind of distinguish between what actually they mean by a drug and what doesn't qualify to be a drug as per their own individual belief and ideas. And there is a reason to that, because many of these psychoactive substances, they are considered illegal. For example, the one on the topmost corner on the left, somebody is injecting a drug, which is probably illegal. Then on the bottom corner on the left-hand side, there is again an example of a psychoactive substance that is illegal. It is cocaine, which is not legally allowed to be sold in a country like India. But again, there are a few psychoactive substances which are legally available, like example, alcohol and cigarettes, which is tobacco product. So it's very important for us to remember that while legally speaking, a substance can be legal or illegal, but technically speaking, from medical perspective, all these amount to be psychoactive. So alcohol and tobacco is as psychoactive as cocaine or heroin would be. We'll come to these different drugs in a bit. But what I'm trying to highlight is that it doesn't matter whether a drug is sanctioned legally in a particular country or not. It can be abused, it can lead to harm, and it can lead to problems. In fact, some of the most common problems that we face in our clinics is because of alcohol and tobacco rather than the illegal drugs. So they are equally important and we must focus on them as well. So there are different types of psychoactive substances. The first one that we are going to talk about is the most common one, that is the tobacco. It's the most common psychoactive substance that is being used globally, including India. It comes in two main forms, that is the smoking form and the smokeless form. But it's not just that there are two forms that are available. What is more important is the number of products that tobacco is available in. There are many forms in which you can smoke tobacco, for example, cigarettes, bidi, hookah, pipe, cigar. In the same way, there are many more products which have smokeless tobacco in them. For example, gutka, khani, zarda, pan masala, tobacco powder. What I'm trying to highlight here is that tobacco is the most common of the psychoactive substances, and probably it is available in most number of products. So it's available easily. It's rather very easy to procure, and that's why it's one of the most commonly used drug as well. In fact, it's the biggest killer globally. It is responsible for most deaths and the most preventable deaths worldwide. And more often than not, it's the first psychoactive substance that somebody uses in his or her life. And that is something that is known as a gateway drug. A gateway drug would mean that a drug that kind of opens the gates for the other drugs. So it's usually very difficult to find a person who is using any other substance or a drug and has not tried tobacco in his or her life. So many believe that if you can stop or prevent tobacco use, cigarette smoking, then it in itself could be a big step towards preventing use of other drugs. The second most common psychoactive substance used in India is alcohol. Again, it is available in many forms. and it's legally available. The legal age of purchasing and consuming alcohol, it kind of varies across different states, but one can easily access this drug as well. What I'm trying to highlight with this slide is that alcohol is available in many forms. There are three main categories that we can put different alcoholic beverages in. The one being the beer, which includes light beer, hard beer. Then there are wines, white wine, red wine, champagne. And then there is something called as distilled spirits, which includes whiskey, vodka, rum, gin. Now, these alcoholic products, they differ from each other, depending on the source from which they come. But more importantly, the alcohol content in these alcoholic beverages is kind of varies. So for example, a beer would have around 4 to 8% of alcohol. So 100 ml of beer will have 4 to 8 ml of alcohol. On the other extreme, distilled spirits, they tend to have a higher percentage of alcohol, something like 40 to 44%. Now, many people tend to believe, and that's not a correct belief, that beer is not alcohol because they think that it's a milder form of alcohol. That's true in part because it has only 4% of alcohol as compared to whiskey, which is around 40% of alcohol. But what exactly matters to an individual is the total amount of alcohol that he or she consumes. So it doesn't matter that beer has 4% alcohol. What matters is how much beer you are consuming. So if you take large quantity of beer, you are actually using the same amount of alcohol that a smaller quantity of whiskey will give you. And that's why many youngsters, they have this misconception that maybe consuming beer is not that harmful. In fact, beer can also lead to addiction. It can also lead to problems. And that's very important for us to remember. Now coming on to cannabis. Cannabis happens to be the most common illegal drug that is available in our country. It ranks third in terms of the most common psychoactive substances in India. Again, it is available in different forms. There is a form that is called as bhang, which people eat either in any beverage or in any food product. Then there is ganja, which is smoked. There is charas, and finally there is hashish oil. Like we discussed about alcohol, the difference among these preparations is that the content of cannabis, the active form of cannabis, that tends to vary. While bhang would have smaller amount of the active ingredient, hashish oil will have a higher concentration. So again, it depends on how much quantity you are consuming, because all of them can lead to problems and it can lead to significant dependence and addiction as well. The fourth most common psychoactive substance or the drug that is being used in India is a class of drugs that is called as opioids. Now, opioids are also plant products. The image on the left hand corner on the top of the screen is a poppy pod from which these opioids are prepared. Then the second image in the center is the image of heroin, which is known as brown sugar or white sugar, which is one of the most commonly abused psychoactive substance in this category. And the third image on the bottom right corner is somebody preparing heroin for injecting purposes. So alcohol, tobacco, people either smoke or ingest orally, but when it comes to heroin or opioids, we're talking about somebody who can inject these drugs. Now, this is important because the problems that drugs cause, it depends A, on the kind of drug that you are using, and B, it also depends on the route through which you consume it. So when we talk about injecting drug use, we are talking about people who are getting exposed to the risks that are related to injecting drug use. And if you are injecting and sharing your equipment, you are exposed to things like HIV, hepatitis, which again is a very major public health problem. And you might be surprised at this slide because these probably are medicines that we use. There is a cough syrup, actions that are used to treat pain, but people tend to abuse them as well. So some of the opioids that are available as medicines for pain or cough, they are also abused. What is important is that we drugs. What is important to remember is that there are some medicines that are available around us which can be abused. And in fact, many children and students, they tend to abuse the medicinal products. So you might consider that it is a medicine, what wrong can it do? But it can be as harmful as any other substance if it is being abused by them. There is another category of substances which is known as stimulants. The one on the left hand side is an image of cocaine, which is one of the most commonly used stimulant drugs worldwide. And the one on the right is an example of MDMA or ecstasy. There are different classes of stimulants. We won't go into technical details, but what I'm trying to highlight is that there are different forms in which drugs are available. Then there are sleeping pills. People are prescribed these pills to take care of their insomnia or sleeping difficulty, but these can also become drugs of abuse for many individuals. There is another category of psychoactive substances which is called as hallucinogens. LSD is one such example. What these drugs do is they make you perceive things or the reality in a distorted way, a way which is not experienced otherwise, and that's why many people, they get pulled to these drugs because they kind of like this effect that takes them away from the reality, and they enjoy this feeling that they get from these drugs like LSD. And finally, there is another category of drugs that is called as inhalants or solvents. This includes very commonly used things like gasoline, the petrol, the diesel, the typewriter eraser, the ink eraser there that we use, the white fluid, even deodorants, perfumes. So basically, these are substances that can be converted into vapors at room temperature, and these are inhaled by the users. And this is again a category of drugs that is being used rather commonly among children and adolescents. In fact, maybe after alcohol and tobacco, and in some studies, they are being used as even a more common form of drugs as compared to tobacco and alcohol by adolescents and children. There is a newer category of drugs that is called as new psychoactive substances. I mean, the drugs that have not been listed in the earlier categories and are being introduced. They are not being covered by the international regulations. They are put into this category. And just to give you an idea, the number of drugs that are there in this list is around 500. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that there are many different types of drugs that are available. It's not one or two things that we're talking about. We're talking about many drugs. Just to go back to this slide, the solvents. There was a study in the United States, and they tried to explore that how many different types of inhalants might be available for people to try. And they came out with a number of around 3,000. So there are around 3,000 products available in US markets which can potentially be used as solvents. So when it comes to drugs, we're talking about big numbers. They are available in many forms. And it's not a unitary concept that we're talking about. It's not a single thing. A drug is not a single entity. Drugs, they tend to differ from each other on many aspects. And these includes the effects. There are some drugs which are stimulants, which kind of activate you, which kind of give you the feeling of increased energy. And there are drugs which are called as depressants, for example, alcohol. These are the drugs that slow you down. And these are the drugs that kind of make you feel relaxed. And then there are hallucinogens, which are LSD. So the drugs, they differ in terms of the effects that they can produce. The drugs also differ in terms of the route of use. For example, some drugs can be used orally, like alcohol. There are others that can be smoked, like cigarettes. There are some that can be inhaled, like the deodorants or the petrol that people use. And then there are drugs which can be injected, for example, heroin. The drugs also differ in terms of the cost. Some of these drugs are cheaper than others are expensive. The drugs also differ in terms of ease of availability. Some of these are easily available. In fact, some are even legal. One can go to a shop and buy these drugs. And there are some that are illegal. And finally, it depends what somebody likes to use. So the personal preference also varies for different drugs. So the point I'm trying to put across is that drugs is not a unitary concept. It's quite complicated. It's very heterogeneous. And we are talking about a very diverse kind of phenomena. So we need to be aware that when we talk about drugs, it's not one or two things that we're talking about. In fact, we are talking about many issues, many things. Now let's come on to the patterns of drug use. The way there are many different types of drugs, there are different patterns of their use as well. Now, in any given population, there are people who have never used a drug. So these are the people who have been abstinent for whole of their life. They have never tried a drug ever in their life. Then there are people who use drugs. The term use would mean that you are taking a substance, you are taking a drug, but you're not experiencing any problems because of it. There are a few like that. Then there are people who are using a drug in a harmful way, which is called as harmful use or abuse. And finally, there is a proportion of people who tend to get addicted to drugs, which is known as dependence. Now, it is very important for us to understand this because not anybody and everybody who is using a drug is a dependent user. You might be a dependent user. You might be somebody who is using it in a harmful way or abusing it. You might be somebody who is just using it and still not experiencing any adverse effects. Or you might be one of those who has never tried a drug in your life. So when we talk about these different categories of patterns of drug use, the one that is at the bottom, that is the dependence, or the one that we call as those who are addicted to a drug, is the most problematic pattern of drug use. Harmful use, these are the people who have some problems, but the extent of problem is less as compared to that of dependence. And people who are using drugs are usually the people who apparently don't have any problem, at least till that point in time. They might have problems later on in their life, but at least at that particular point in time, they are not experiencing any difficulties due to their substance use. Now, somebody who is dependent user tends to use large quantity of drugs. Now, understanding this is important because it will help us understand the kind of complications that somebody can experience because of drug use. So somebody who is a dependent user, who is addicted to a substance, is using the drug in large quantities and usually many times, many times within a day, in fact. So people who are dependent users, they can't live without the substance. They have to use it every day and many times within a day. People who are abusing or who are having harmful use, they are usually consuming it in large quantities, but may be using it in smaller quantities as well. And also the frequency of use, it can vary from a single use to multiple time use. So it might happen that you use a substance for a single time, but it can lead to problems. For example, if you take alcohol for the first time and you use a few drinks, maybe 2 or 3 drinks, and then you go out in your car driving and you can meet with an accident. So there you're talking about a single use of a substance which can lead to problems. So it does not necessarily mean that you have to be a dependent user to suffer the consequences of drugs. You can use a drug only once in a greater quantity and still you can suffer harm because of it. And finally, there are people who are using it. They usually consume it in small quantities or moderate quantities, and they can use it at either once, or the other spectrum could be they are using it many times. There are individuals who can use a psychoactive substance on a daily basis and still not experience problems. It's very important for us to understand that it's not that using drug is equivalent to having problems. Many might not experience the problems because of many reasons. I mean, it depends on many things, and we'll be talking about those things in a bit. Typically, somebody who is using a substance, he or she goes through different phases or stages. The first one is at the bottom in the left-hand corner. It's called experimentation. This is actually the first stage when you kind of try a substance for the first time. You kind of want to see what it feels like using a drug. You kind of want to see how the experience is, and that's the first step towards using any substance. From experimentation, one moves on to the irregular use. So you might use it maybe once in a while in a party, once in a month, once in 6 months. You can use it when you're trying to celebrate something. You might have a reason to do that. Then you move on to the next phase, which is called as regular use. So you tend to use the substance more frequently, maybe every weekend, maybe more than once in a week, something like that. Then you move on to the daily use. You are using a substance on a daily basis, but still you can control it. Maybe you use it in the evening or at a time when you're not doing anything else. And then you move on to the final category, that is the dependence, when you kind of have lost the control and you are using it on a daily basis and many times within the same day. So if you look at an individual cross-sectionally at some point in time, you can have that person at any of these stages. So it's not that you get dependent on a drug straight away. You need to go through different phases. And the time that it takes for you to move from experimentation to dependence, it can vary. It can vary depending on you, your personality, your pattern of use. It can vary depending on the kind of drug that you are consuming. And there are different factors that decide. So you might find a person who is experimenting today, but maybe 2 years down the line, that person may become dependent. But what is important to remember here is that you won't become dependent if you don't experiment. That's the rule. So for somebody to become dependent, you have to experiment someday. And that's why it's very important that we talk about this particular group of people who are not yet experiencing addiction, who are not yet experiencing any problems, but still they're important because they might experience these problems some later day because they are likely to get dependent. There are chances for them getting dependent. And why it's important for us, this group, to know about this. This again, this is a finding from the same survey that we talked about. And these are school-going children. Now look at the ages at which they start using the substance. I mean, this is the age when these students are with you. They are in the school. They are studying. It's like the age at which people reported of using tobacco, the mean age or the average age was 13 years. So most of the people who actually end up becoming addicted or who end up having dependence on substance use, they actually experiment while they're in the school. And it's not very different whether you're in a school or you are a dropout from the school. The age of initiation is almost comparable. So it's very important for us to remember that we are looking at these kids at a stage in their life when they are trying to use this substance probably for the first time in their life. And hence we are in a position where we can do a lot for them. But before we learn what we can do for these students, let's try to understand that what is it about drugs that these students they like. The single most important factor that drives somebody towards a drug use is the sense of curiosity. I mean, students, they get to know about that there is something called a drug, there is something called a psychoactive substance, there is something called a cigarette, there is something called as a beer. And there are people who use it. And they're curious to know, they're curious to feel firsthand what it feels like using that thing. That is the one most important thing that drives these students towards drug use or experimentation. But that is just one of the factors. Another very important factor that kind of determines whether a student will experiment with a drug or not is the peer pressure or the peer group that you are affiliated with. If you have friends who are open to experimentation, if you have friends who are open to taking that risk of getting caught, you are more likely to try out a drug. If you have friends who are kind of not open to this idea, who are not okay with getting caught with drug use, they are less likely to experiment. And if you are a member of such a peer group, your chances of using a drug also get down. Another factor that is important in terms of experimentation is the availability. If a drug is easily available, there are more chances that you will be trying to use it or experiment it. If the drug is less available, your chances of experimentation are less. Now, I like to mention here that this is what we're talking about, the experimentation or the initial use. Once you get addicted to a drug, then these factors, they don't play much of a role. Because once you are addicted, it doesn't matter what your friends tell you. It's the drug that dictates the terms. So while the peer group is more important when you are in the initial phases, it plays less role during the later phases. Similarly, the availability. While it might be very difficult to experiment a drug that is not easily available, but if you are addicted to a drug, you will find ways to make it available for you, because then you won't stop because it's not easily available. You will make efforts to get these drugs. There are many other reasons. For example, stress. Stress is a very important factor that makes many people try out drugs, because they are being told by their friends that if you take this substance, you'll forget all your worries. And that is a very important factor that kind of pushes the students towards drug use. What research has shown is that many who have a mental health problem are not exactly a disorder per se, a disease per se, but if you tend to feel lonely, if you tend to feel depressed, if you are anxious, if you're not comfortable in company of others, your chances of trying out a substance is high. So that again is a very important factor. And finally, one of the most important risk factor is the tendency to take risk, the tendency to explore your limits, the tendency to test your own limits. So if you are high on that risk-taking attitude, if your attitude to take risk is higher, then you are more likely to experiment. And there are biological reasons for this. Now, this is a slide that I've taken from NIDA. This is the National Institute on Drug Abuse from USA. And what it tells us is that if you move from the left hand of this spectrum to the right hand, you can say that the brain changes as we grow old. This is starting from the age 5 to the age 20. And the part that they are focusing on is the center, this front part, which is called as the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex. Now you can see that in a 5-year-old, this part is greenish in color, which means it is less mature. And as you move along the age, it tends to turn blue. And these are the colors that you get on imaging studies. And the blue means it is more mature. Now, this is the part of the brain that tells us when to stop. When we have an impulse to do something, this is the part of the brain that tells us whether we should go ahead with our plans. It kind of helps us analyze the risk that is involved. So an adult is in a position, his or her brain is in that position to exercise that caution, while somebody who is not an adult yet or an adolescent or is a children or is a child, his or her brain is not prepared to deal with those dilemmas. So that is when they are told by their peer group, by their friends, why don't you take a drag? Why don't you take a puff? They don't think the consequences, they just go with it. And that's why most of the drug use, it starts in this age group. People who can go without experimenting by the age of 25, they're very less likely to get dependent on drugs. So they are very less likely to abuse drugs later in their life. So this is the biological explanation that why students or children and adolescents, they are more likely to experiment. But the reasons are not limited to the user per se. I mean, the reasons go well beyond the students. There might be problems at home. There might be stressors in the family, which kind of make them anxious or make them uncomfortable, and that might push them towards drug use. Then the role of role models, the people that one looks up to. If the role model believes in using a cigarette or taking a drink once in a while, then you kind of try to model your behavior on them as well. And finally, there is the role of genetics. Addiction to a large extent is a genetic disease. So if there is a family history of drug dependence, if there is somebody in the family who was hooked onto drugs, chances of you getting addicted are even higher. So there are many factors. There are many push and pull factors. There are things that push you towards drug use, and there are factors that pull you towards drug use. And many of these are actually beyond control. For example, genetics, you can't do much about that. Even what's going on in your family, you might not be in a position to do that. But then there are a few things that we can work upon. For example, this feeling of curiosity, this feeling of risk-taking, this feeling of not feeling good, the mental health issues that somebody is having. And we'll come to that in a bit. Now, I have mentioned that there are different phases to the problem of drug abuse. It ranges from experimentation on one extreme to dependence on the other extreme. When we talk about students, the main issues that they face because of drug use is related to problems in their health and problems in the academics. I mean, if they start doing drugs, they might experience some adverse physical health problems, and they might not do well in their studies. Their grades may fall, they might not perform to their level. And this is probably what they understand, the potential problems that could be there in their life later on as well. So they kind of happen to know that, okay, cigarette smoking can lead to cancer. Injecting drug use can lead to HIV and AIDS. But what they don't know is that addiction involves problems in multiple domains of our lives. We can face physical problems, we can have psychological problems. People who abuse drugs, they are more likely to be depressed. They are more likely to experience mental health problems. There are problems in academics, that is quite obvious, but it can lead to problems in finances as well. Once you get addicted to a drug, you tend to lose money. You lose your savings. You kind of take loans from others and you're not able to pay them back. There are problems in the family and society. There is discord in the family. There is a stigma that is there with drug use. There could be legal problems. If you are buying an illegal substance, I mean, you can face the problem there with the law and the regulatory agencies. What we need to understand is that drug use is not only doing bad things to your body, it is doing a lot of bad to your psyche, to your performance in your academics, to the financial aspect of your life, to the family, to the society that you are living in, and you can face even legal consequences. So this is what we need to emphasize when we are trying to educate the students about drug use and the problems. We should not focus only on the physical problems. We need to highlight these issues as well. Now, the problems because of drug use, it will be more if you are dependent, it will be less if you are experimenting. That's a very logical conclusion. But we must remember that even a single experimentation can lead to problems. People who use substances, even as a recreational drug or even for a single time, they are likely to face adverse consequences like driving while they're intoxicated or unsafe sex, or they might engage in other risk-taking behavior that they might not do when they are sober. So you need not, I mean, it's not that you have to wait for 10 years to experience the consequences. The consequences can be right there with the first use itself. So we need to tell our students this as well, that it's not that you will stop someday and then problems will go away. You can face problems even if you're not using a drug on a regular basis, even if you are an experimental user. Even then there can be problems because of substance use. Now, I mentioned earlier regarding this slide, there are people who have never used, and then there are people who are dependent users. If we talk about India, the people who have never used a substance, that's the biggest proportion of this pie chart. And people who are dependent users are always in a minority. I mean, be it tobacco, be it alcohol, be it cannabis, or be it opioids. What I'm trying to mention here is that in at least in Indian setting, there are more non-users as compared to users. But the problem is that we can't actually predict that somebody who is using it for the first time today, whether he'll become dependent or not. We can't predict somebody who is using it for the first time today, whether he'll go on to become a regular user or not. And that's the biggest challenge that we are facing. That although we know that most of the people who are experimenting today, they might not become a dependent user or an abuser, but for a given person, for a given individual, it's very difficult to tell that person that, okay, you can experiment because I know that you won't become a dependent user. And that's why it's very important that we give this message that you should not experiment, because experimentation is the first step towards becoming addicted. And it's better if you don't take that step. Now let's talk about how to identify the drug use among the students. Again, it's very important we remember here. It's very easy to identify drug use if you are a dependent user, because you might have many adverse consequences because of drug use. But if you are during the initial phases or the phase of experimentation or irregular use, it might be a very big challenge to pick up drug use, because you might not have many problems, you might not have many signs and symptoms. And what you have to look up to is the indirect and very subtle signs. A person who is experimenting, which is very likely to be the case when it comes to the students that you're working with, you need to go for very indirect and very subtle kind of things there. The first thing that we need to notice is any potential change in behavior, because people who use drugs, you will notice that their behavior changes. They might get more irritable, they might not be as friendly as they used to be, they might like to avoid some people. So that kind of change in behavior is one of the earliest signs of possibility of drug use. You might also observe that there is a change in the friends that a student is having. Earlier, he might be within a group that was more involved in academics or member of a team that was playing a sport, but then you will observe that the kid is moving on to another friends who probably themselves are also using drugs. If you ask such a student that what's wrong with him or her, he or she might come with a very unsatisfactory kind of a reason. He might try to avoid or might give you an excuse that you don't find valid enough to explain what you're observing in the student. And these kids, they tend to get angry very easily, because if you talk to them about that, you notice certain changes in them, it annoys them, it kind of makes them angry, and they might try to push you away. They might try to avoid you, they might try not to talk to you. You might observe that they are withdrawing from the usual family bonding routines and activities that they were involved in earlier. There might be a change there. These students, they might prefer to be left alone, so that it gives them an opportunity to use the substance or the drug. Rather than going out with the family or participate in family functions, they might prefer to stay home, because that again gives them a chance to be alone and probably try out the substance. And if there are certain restrictions that have been put on them, they will try to violate them. If they have been told not to be out of the house after a specific time, or if they have been told not to meet with certain people, they might violate these restrictions, because these are the situations that kind of give them a chance to try out the drugs. They might show lack of motivation or apathy. They might not be driven enough to study. They might not be driven enough to participate in co-curricular activities. They might not be driven enough to answer a question if being asked. There might be changes in personality. For example, they might become a bit rude. They might become defiant. They might show disrespect to the authority figures. And they might become manipulative and secretive as well. Because once you are using substances, not only you have to hide your behavior, you have to hide the substance as well. You need to arrange for the money as well. And because of these reasons, you might tend to be manipulated. You might come up with reasons why you need that money. You might come up with excuses why you need the money from the parents. And you can also experience certain psychiatric symptoms, for example, depression and mood instability, irritability. That is again a very common consequence of substance use. And then the most important indicators, you can find a student intoxicated. Intoxication would mean that you are observing the signs of drug use. The child might be having bloodshot eyes, slurring of speech, not able to sit properly, very restless, feeling sleepy, drowsy, these kind of things. And you might find certain possessions on the student, for example, the drug in itself, or the route through which the drug is used. So somebody who is injecting drugs, you might find a syringe or a needle with the child. You might find a foil on which they kind of heat the drug and then they consume it. So these are some of the indicators that point towards possibility of substance use, and we must be vigilant about this. But one of the most important and indirect marker of possible substance use in students is that they tend to skip the classes and their grades, they start to fall without any apparent reason. So this is probably one of the earliest signs that the teacher or a counselor can come to know of a possible problem with the kid. And one of the reasons for this could be the substance use or the drug use. What we can do, I mean, we can do a lot. Having a campus, having a school where there are no drugs available, that is a must. But what research and evidence tells us that it's very difficult to exercise this, because you might ensure that there are no drugs on the campus, but beyond the campus, you might have very little authority. You might have very little restrictions. So we need to focus on the push and the pull factors, the things that make a student experiment with the drug. We need to focus on those reasons as well. And it makes a lot of sense to have students that are better prepared to handle this issue. Rather than waiting for them to start a substance and then telling them how wrong it is, it's way better to prepare them well in advance, that so that they don't even experiment with the substances later in their life. And what we need to do is we need to work on the protective and the risk factors. We know what pushes a student towards drug use. We also know what can prevent him from using a drug. And we need to work on both these sets of factors. That's very important. One of the most important things is that when we talk about drugs to our students, we need to talk about all the drugs. Many times we tend to focus on a few, which we think are the most serious ones. And we tend to ignore a few because we think that they are the less common ones or the less problematic ones. But once we are talking about drugs, we need to include all the drugs because you might focus on opioids or cocaine or heroin, but you might miss alcohol, which could be an equally damaging or equally harmful substance to any particular individual. So always include all the substances when you talk about drug use to your children or your students. There are different techniques that have been recommended depending on the age and the level of understanding that the students might be having. So for those who are in the elementary school, one needs to focus on self-control, being aware of your emotions. If you are feeling sad or bad, how to communicate that and not to resort to drug use to handle those things. Communication, talking to others, talking to parents, talking to students and sharing what you're going through, what kind of dilemma you are facing. Then focusing on social problem solving is very important because that's one thing that the students face day in, day out. They are met with situations where they need to find the answers and they need to know how to do that. And if they are facing any academic problems, they need to be supported there as well. If you're talking about the slightly older children, middle and higher classes, you need to focus on communication, peer relation. That is very important. How you should deal with your peer group, what are the kind of friends that you should have around you, and how do you respond in such a group? What is okay and what is not okay? You need to focus on self-efficacy and assertiveness. How to say no, how to put your point of view forward and not just to go with what others are telling you. Drug resistance skills, how to say no to drugs, and reinforcement of anti-drug attitude. Because see, drugs is not something that we are born with. It's something that we learn as we grow old. So that usually happens because there is a space in our life for us to experiment with drugs. So if you can fill that void with something else, with an alternative, then the chances of somebody using or trying out drugs, it goes down drastically. This is a very common misconception that drug use is a norm. If you talk to students who are willing or open to experimentation, this is what they tell, that everybody else is doing it, so why not me? This is a very major misconception, and there is evidence to that, at least in India. Now, these are findings from tobacco survey that was done a bit back in the year 2009. It was a pan-India kind of a survey among school students who were 13 to 15 years old. And when they were asked that how many of them have used a tobacco product in the last month, only 15% said yes. This is a very important message that we need to give to our students. Drug use is not a norm. It's not a done thing. It's not an in thing. Very few do that. And you need not be part of that minority because there are most of us around, most of those who are around us in our class, they are not using drugs. So this is a very important message that we need to put across. And these are the three main areas that we need to focus on. Assertiveness, how to say no. I mean, when you don't want to do something, you should be able to tell others that yes, you don't want it, no matter what the others think of you. We need to focus on life skills training, the social, psychological, cognitive, and attitudinal factors that help you develop these skills, which are of use not only to prevent drug use, but to lead your life in a more positive or a productive way. And finally, encouraging a drug-free lifestyle, engaging in activities that are not conducive to drug use, being in groups that prevent you from being with the peer group who is more open to drug use. We need to focus on these things as well. Again, I am repeating what I told in the last session. Teachers and counselors are in a great position to pick up this issue. They're in a great position to communicate this to the students, and they probably are one of the best people around to deal with this issue. But you must also know that there will be a few in your class, in your school, who probably won't be helped with what you can offer to them. And these are the ones that need formal help. Drug abuse is dealt with as a medical problem. If you are addicted, if you are dependent, you need treatment. And there is treatment that is available, which is very effective, which is very simple, and it is available around you. So you must be aware of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr.